April 11th, 2017, Black Ops 2 became backwards compatible. The crew would play it a lot, as BO2 is probably the greatest COD of all time. Most of the group would indulge in private match S&D sniping with each other, and a lot of private matches Grief and Zombies, Mob of the Dead. The main players that would be enjoying this were Will, Jason, Peter, Frosty Steel, and Dan. And of course players like Craig, Nexron, Sammy, Trayvon, and even occasionally Cesar would join in for the fun, and the group would have a blast. Fast forwarding almost a year, late January 2018, Fortnite was in prime effect, and the COD World War II tournament was months behind at this point. BO2 would be put to the side temporarily because of how thriving Fortnite was, but the group was looking for one last sniping tournament. But there was one issue. COD World War II was highly disliked among the group, and there was no way of another tournament being hosted on that game. But the group had an idea. The group, mainly led by Peter, wanted to do one last tournament on BO2. Now that the game was backwards compatible, it would be a much easier task to gather people for the game, and BO2, of course, was highly loved among the group. Will was considering trying to even get Simon and Sam to play in this tournament, but that would be a hard task, and he decided against it. The usual suspects would of course participate in this tournament. Jason, Adrian, coming off a championship, Sammy, Trayvon, Peter, Chris C, Frosty, Dan, and Trev. Nexron and Craig would both be coming back from last season, and Mike would be making a return for the BO2 tournament. And just like that, we had 12 players. Not the most intimidating group of players, but some good and bad players, just like usual. Now you would think the favorites to win the tournament would be the normal players, Jason, Adrian, Chris C. And that was mostly true, but there was a few twists. Chris C, a very good player who just came off a very disappointing season, only losing in round 3, would be only the 7th highest odds to win the tournament. This was mainly due to his lack of playtime on BO2. Chris C, a great player, but started off on COD on AW and was not even a prestige on BO2, so his natural talent would have to carry him in this tournament. Of course, Adrian, the clear favorite to win it all, with Jason and Sammy shortly behind. Trayvon would of course be the 4th highest favorite, coming off his semis appearance and being a very good player on BO2. Peter would actually be the 5th highest odds, as over his career, he has been an average player, but he would rack up a lot of playtime on BO2, and would be better on BO2 than most other games. This was mainly due to him playing actually on his Wii U a lot back then, and he just overall had a lot more experience on BO2. Early February, the tournament would start. Of course, our permanent map would be none other than Nuketown, with the DSR and the Ballista being the 2 snipers allowed, and round 1 would be underway. Our first match of round 1 would be the Season 8 rematch between Dan and Trev. Dan, coming off easily his best season in World War II, and looking still not very good, but way better than before, was a small favorite against the awful, 0 career win Trev. But nonetheless, this game would be good. and in classic fashion, Dan would beat Trev yet again 20-19. This would prove to be a horrible loss for an already bad player in Trev, blowing a 15-8 lead to Dan somehow, and moving Dan on to the winner's bracket of round 2. What a start to the tournament. Our next match was an interesting one. Mike, a player with only one career win, a player that plays every game close no matter how good or bad the opponent is, a very strange and inconsistent player, would be going up against Craig. Craig was thought to be a decent sniper, but would suffer one of the most embarrassing losses of all time, losing against Dan last season 20-16. With this, Mike would be a small favorite to win the game, but still an evenly matched game. Would Craig be able to bounce back from his awful loss to Dan last season? And in absolutely a crazy start to the season, Craig would win in another 20-19 match. Craig started the game off on fire, dominating early, but Mike would start to make a crazy comeback effort and would get it to eventually a 19-19 affair, but Craig would get the last laugh to move on to the winner's bracket. So far, we started off with back-to-back 20-19 games, a Season 8-like start. With our next match would be a very interesting and telling match. Peter versus Chris C. This match would be 2 question marks. Would Chris C be able to play well on a game he doesn't play much? And would Peter be an actual threat in this tournament? 2 questions we have no idea of until we get to see this match. Peter, in probably his most impressive win of all time, would dominate in the late game. Chris C started off great, but Peter would start to catch fire and go on a crazy run to win the game 20-12, looking great and moving on to the winner's bracket. This is the match that we've all been waiting for. The top 2 favorites would play each other in round 1, and probably the best rivalry of all time up to this point, and both players being the last 2 champions, with some beef between the two. Adrian being a small favorite, but as we know, this game could go either way. You have just watched one of the best games ever played. A game where both snipers were so good, both not missing very often. Jason would start the match off on fire, going up 8-3, but Adrian would however take over the rest of the game, with Jason playing out of his mind and yet still finding himself down 19-17. But Jason would do what Adrian would roast him for constantly after, and something very controversial, and camp hard in the room. But Jason didn't miss a single shot after being down 19-17, and in bizarre fashion got a hit marker with a 19-19 score, but ending it off winning in a third nail-biter to this tournament. And really briefly, Frosty Steel was actually sick at this time and would forfeit round 1 versus Nexron. Our final match of round 1 was another banger, the epic semifinals rematch from Trayvon versus Sammy. And just like Jason versus Adrian, Sammy a small favorite, but a match that could truly go either way. This would be another classic between Sammy and Trayvon, but Sammy would yet again win it, sending him to play Jason in round 2 for our very highly anticipated match. Round 1 was electric, giving off Season 8 vibes to start it off with 3 nail-biters and a 20-18 classic. Round 2 would be a huge round for some players. Adrian would have to make another loser's bracket run, but that's something he did last season and won in dominant fashion. Jason and Sammy would both be looking at a huge match against each other. Dan, having some life after winning, but not much hope going against Peter. Mike and Frosty would both be looking for at least one loser's bracket win versus each other. Craig, looking strong, bouncing back from that last awful loss to Dan, but would have a huge test versus Nexron. Chris C wouldn't have much hope left, due to him playing Trayvon next, and Trev, in classic fashion, would forfeit versus Adrian. Our first match round 2 wasn't a great one. Peter would be a heavy favorite going into this game, but Dan has shown some improvements, and those improvements would mean next to nothing in this match, as Peter would go on to completely dominate the match, having another very strong showing, and going 2-0 to start the tournament for the first time in his career, and Dan would look for a prayer in the loser's bracket. Our next match would easily be the best of round 2, with Jason versus Sammy, both snipers looking like strong candidates to win it all, both coming off of strong round 1 wins, especially Jason after beating the reigning champion and the favorite to win it all in an amazing showdown. Would Jason be able to continue his spree of terror? Wow. In one of the biggest plot twists in tournament history, Sammy would not only win, but completely destroy Jason, proving to be Jason's worst loss since his 20-5 loss versus Chris R in Season 6. Sammy, we already knew was a good player, but this would elevate him even further, and Jason looking completely lost in this one, after looking very sharp just a round to go versus Adrian. But Jason still had life, and just like his rival Adrian, would need to dig from the loser's bracket. Frosty Steel was now healthy after recovering from a torn ACL, and looking to make a return, and he would be playing Mike. Mike has a rare problem where he has a close game no matter what, no matter how much of a favorite or underdog he is. In this one, he would be a small favorite, in what was expected to be another close game. Wow! Frosty playing one of his best games of all time, being up even 13-3 before Mike would nearly do the impossible, coming all the way back and even getting up to 18 kills. Frosty would end it and finally win a match that's not 20-19, eliminating Mike and sending Frosty on to the next. This would be a fun game perhaps. Nextron versus Craig. Craig, finally looking like a decent player last round, would have a solid test versus Nextron, a player that has shown that he can make a run. This would be a fun one. In crazy fashion, Craig would actually destroy Nextron in this one, not something people saw coming. Craig would seem to find a new strategy, camping behind the classic car on Nuketown, and occasionally go for spawn traps. This would be the beginning of the Craig car. Stay tuned. Our last match of round 2 would of course be another classic rivalry. Chris C versus Trayvon, a series in which a close game would always be inevitable, but Chris C wasn't the normal good player he usually is on BO2. Would this match be a close one? In an exact same fashion as last season, Chris C would dominate the early game, but Trayvon would pull off another comeback, being down 14-9 at one point, but would go off in the late game and make a run, winning the match 20-17, eliminating Chris C in round 2 for the first time of his career. Round 2 ends, and is a very interesting start to the tournament. Peter gets the bye week to the semifinals for his first ever semis appearance in his career. Sammy and Craig playing each other in the winner's bracket for a semis appearance. And Jason and Adrian, the two dominant and best players, would both have to make a loser's bracket run to win it, in surprising fashion. But fortunately for Adrian, he would have a favorable matchup, playing Frosty in round 2. A very played matchup, with Adrian dominating their last two matches, and this one would be even worse for Frosty, as Adrian would set a record for the biggest blowout, winning 20-4 in this one, looking like a god, and Frosty would get eliminated. Adrian's partner in crime, Jason, would also be playing a favorable match, Nextron, but just one season ago, Jason would lose to Nextron, so he would need a good revenge game in this one. Would Jason be able to bounce back after his horrific loss to Sammy? Jason, looking back in form, doing what he should have done last season, dominating next round 20-11 to move on to the quarterfinals to play the winner of Trayvon versus Dan. Our next match would be an interesting one, Sammy versus Craig. Sammy being a good favorite in this game, but Craig looking really good so far after losing to Dan just a season ago, and has seemed to have found a new strategy, head glitching behind the Craig car. Would this be enough to beat Sammy and move on to the semis? Sammy, keeping his momentum alive, as Craig put up a decent fight, but Sammy, and it was what is possibly his best season yet, would move on yet again to the semifinals, and Craig would play Adrian in the quarterfinals. Our last match of round 3 would be a boring one, with Trayvon versus Dan. Trayvon, being the clear and obvious favorite to win this, would look to dominate Dan and move on to play Jason in the quarterfinals. This doesn't make sense. Hold on a second. Dan, in a game he actually played well in, would beat Trayvon, but something just seemed off about this match though. Trayvon would claim he let Dan win, and it would appear that way on the last kill. So I'll let you guys be the judge of that. Did Trayvon let Dan win, or was Trayvon trying? Either way, Dan would move on to play Jason in the quarterfinals for his first ever playoff appearance. Dan would make it quarterfinals, not a sentence I ever imagined uttering. Dan would have a true test, however, as he would play Jason in the quarterfinals. Jason, of course, would be a massive favorite in this game, but this would be a great moment for Dan to prove that he is made for the playoffs and was ready to make a big jump in his game and be a top sniper. Well, what can I say? Jason would set the record, beating out Adrian's 20-4 win just a round ago, and winning 20-1. Yes, 20-1 against Dan. Dan shouldn't have even been here, and Trayvon did say a reason he let Dan win is because Trayvon wouldn't have beat Jason anyways, according to him at least. Jason would move on to play Peter in the semifinals. Our next match would be a fun one. Adrian, an infamous trash talker, would talk so much trash to Craig in our fantasy football group chat, saying that he could hide behind the Craig car all he wants and it wouldn't matter, and Adrian would be a massive favorite in this game. Would he be able to back up his trash talk? Adrian would destroy Craig, taunting and making Craig rage quit. Adrian would be able to back up his trash talk, and just like that, Jason and Adrian would both make a full climb out of the losers bracket and make it to the semis. Adrian moving on to play Sammy. 2 quarterfinals games, 2 blowouts. However, the semis would surely have more to offer. Sammy versus Adrian, the finals rematch from last season. This one would be a lot different though, as Adrian would have to win twice to move on to the finals, and Sammy this season has looked like the best version of Sammy, dominating players like Jason, and looking really sharp in this tournament, but Adrian would still be a small favorite to win this series, as Adrian was still the best mechanical player in the tournament. Adrian would look great in this one, giving the great Sammy his first loss of the season in convincing fashion and looking to do the same in Game 2 to move on to his second straight finals. Sammy wouldn't go down this time, having a great match versus the great player in Adrian, and he would take Adrian down in convincing fashion, and Adrian almost making a late game comeback, but Sammy would move on to his 4th ever finals appearance after eliminating the best player in the tournament. Peter versus Jason, an odd semis, as Peter looked solid in this tournament, but still, Jason was the favorite, as Jason is simply the better player. But Peter would finally have a chance to go above and beyond for once. Jason would need to win twice to move on to the finals. Jason, just as expected, would dominate Game 1, 20-13, and looking ready to make another championship run. But Peter claimed to be eating chips and laying back in this game, a very odd thing to do in a semifinals game. And Peter, a player who hasn't won a playoff game, and would constantly do decent but lose in the quarterfinals, would stand no chance against Jason, a one-time champion, a great player, in his prime. Peter would have little hope of winning Game 2. my god. Peter, in what is debatably a top 3 match to ever be played, would pull the upset, beating the great Jason. Peter would dominate the match early and would be looking to close it out in shocking fashion, being up 15-10. But then Jason, yet again, would make another comeback, looking to close it out, being up 17-16. But then, it would happen. Jason would chase Peter to the same room that Jason camped versus Adrian in round 1. Both players exchanged some misses, and Peter would throw a prayer, a bank shot tomahawk, in one of the most infamous moments in sniping tournament history, and it was all Peter after that, and he would eventually close it out 20-18 in an insane match to move to his first finals appearance to play Sammy. Possibly the best semifinals game of all time, but Peter would need to pull yet another upset in a one-game winner-go-home finals. Sammy was 0-3 in the finals, getting outclassed by Will and Adrian in his finals losses, but this would be Sammy's best chance to finally get one. The only finals that Sammy was favored in, looking really good in this tournament. The match between the two would be played, even though it was a whole week after Peter versus Jason, and Sammy would come down with a sickness, but this would still be his match to win. Peter pulling off one of the greatest underdog stories of all time, and the closest finals match so far, though the match wouldn't play out like a close one, with Peter dominating the match early on, and Sammy would never fully recover from this, though he got the match close a few different times, but Peter would close it out, and even players like Adrian, an infamous trash talker, would congratulate him, but not everyone was happy with this outcome. Sammy would sadly be 0-4 in the finals now, and Peter would join the champions, getting his first ring and solidifying himself as a Hall of Famer after years of mediocrity, all according to Peter's plan. I told you guys, we got all the bad tournaments out of the way, and this tournament just did not disappoint at all. The best match of the tournament goes to, and for the first time, we're going to give this a co-award. We're going to give it to 2 awards. Well, actually, we did it last season with Trayvon and Dan winning it, but either way, it's going to go to Jason versus Adrian and Peter versus Jason semifinals game 2. Now, both of these matches are very deserving of this award, and I'll talk firstly about Jason versus Adrian. So, round 1, probably the best rivalry of all time, at least one of the best rivalries, and this game was honestly just crazy. Now, both players this was probably the only time that both of these players played, like, at their full peaks. And this was a match where both players played insanely well. Jason really played, like, extraordinarily well in this, and yet he still found himself down in this game. I mean, that just shows how good Adrian is, but Jason getting the 3 unanswered kills, not missing a single shot after 1917, and getting even a hit mark at 19 and 19 was just a crazy, intense match. I mean, this is one of the most fun matches to watch, and then even the trash talk after with Adrian saying, "Oh, you kept in the room, Jason," blah, blah, blah. It was just, I mean, it was extraordinary. Best rivalry of all time. The top 2 favorites going at it in round 1. This match did not disappoint at all. On the other hand, I mean, Peter versus Jason, probably one of the best matches ever to be played. A huge, huge upset, and just a crazy, unexpected match. Yes, it wasn't 2019 like Jason versus Adrian, but it doesn't even matter, because this match was just... I mean, this match had it all. It had a comeback from Jason, Peter, like an upset win. Peter was started off dominating early. It had the crazy bank shot tomahawk, and this was like probably the most controversial match of all time. Because Peter actually tried to claim that it was skill and like it wasn't fully luck, which, I mean, I don't know if I fully believe that, but either way, it was just crazy. And Peter just dominating after that tomahawk, getting the 2 kills right after that, and then closing the match out, 20-18. I mean, this match was just electric. It had everything. It had the flashy moment with the tomahawk, the comeback story. It just did not disappoint at all. And this is still, I mean, it lives up to this day as one of the best matches of all time. And that's what I have to say about that one. The best underdog story of the tournament, there's no other answer besides Peter. Peter is the only, and this is probably the best underdog story of all time. At least it's definitely up there. I mean, I'd probably say this is the best underdog story of all time, especially those last 2 wins for Peter, especially the one against Jason. Peter was a sniper who was solid, you know, made some improvements, but would always come short in the quarterfinals and just couldn't get over that really hump once he made that playoff appearance. But this was kind of just a magical season for Peter, a Cinderella story, if you will. But, like I said, beating Jason and then beating Sammy, especially the win against Jason, and Jason probably, you could say this is the best Jason we've seen, even better than Season 8, because Jason was really good in the season, and he actually did care, unlike his World War II season, so, yeah, Peter getting the underdog story win, and by the way, it was just really funny with him and Jason arguing and bickering after this. Like, it was definitely one of the more, like, funny, like, mini rivalries, whatever you want to call it, but Peter with this whole plan for this tournament, and just like I said, this is definitely one of the best, probably the best underdog story of all time, and of course Peter's gonna win this award, getting his first ever championship, and yeah, that's pretty much all I have to say. The most loved sniper of the tournament, and in heartbreaking fashion, sadly, he lost in the finals. This is Sammy. Sammy was just really, I mean, like I said, in most tournaments, he was probably the most loved sniper, because Sammy, kind of similar to Peter, was an underdog, except this was probably the one tournament he wasn't really an underdog in, except in his match versus Adrian in the semis, and I guess for one versus Jason earlier on. But Sammy, this is the one tournament where he was probably on par with the best snipers in the tournament. Like, he was definitely on par with Jason and Adrian. And I mean, he beat both Jason and Adrian in this tournament, and destroying Jason especially in round 2, which is kind of a crazy turning point in this tournament. But yeah, Sammy, the most loved sniper in the tournament, just, I mean, how good he was, and of course, like, I mean, it's a Sammy, you know, he's a great guy, funny guy, and this is, you know, he's gonna get this award. The most hated sniper of the tournament, I mean, it's going to Adrian. It's kind of a classic. It's, you know, it's basically the same thing as Taher. He's just a cocky player, you know, I mean, you guys see it, like, he shoots bodies. You guys don't see what he says in, like, the chats or anything like that, because, dude, that him and Craig match was, like, super toxic, and then, of course, him and Jason. It's just a classic for Adrian. He's gonna win this award. The most improved player of the tournament, and this one's actually gonna go to Craig. Now, yes, you could argue this one goes to Peter, because he, you know, went from a player that was, like, consistently making quarters to, I mean, just winning it all. And yes, that is a fair argument, but I'm gonna give this to Craig instead of Peter. First of all, I'm trying to split up the underdog and improved players, and I think the improved player makes more sense to give this to Craig. And the reason for that is because Peter was already, like, a solid player, though he did lose in round 3 last season, I get that. But Peter was already a solid player, just not a good, like, a great player, whatever you want to call it. But Craig came from losing to Dan to making a playoff appearance, so I think that's definitely more of a jump than Peter, who already, like, was a playoff player. Both, like I said, big jumps, and you could really give this award to Peter as well. That's totally fine. But I'm going to give this one to Craig. The biggest disappointment of the tournament, this is going to go to Trayvon. For him losing against Dan. Now, this is an odd one because Trayvon debatably didn't try against Dan. And yes, you could argue even if you're not trying against Dan, you should still be able to beat him, which is fair. And this one's confusing because I'm not sure if Trayvon, if it was one of those things where Trayvon was trying a while and Dan was actually keeping up. And then Trayvon decided at the end to let Dan win. This is a weird one, or maybe he just didn't decide to let Dan win at all and did some weird strategy. But either way, Trayvon, a player who honestly before the season was pretty good, making at least 4 straight playoff appearances with 2 semifinals appearances, not even making the playoffs in this one after projecting to be a top 4 player in the tournament, is definitely going to warrant him this award. Now, the main reason he said he didn't try against Dan is because Trayvon, in his words, had no chance of beating Jason in the quarterfinals. And now, that is a fair argument. I think Jason probably would have beaten Trayvon, but I think it would have been a decent match at least. Better at least than Jason versus Dan, jeez. But, yeah, this is easily going to go to Trayvon. There's not many other contestants for this anyways. You could argue next Ron, which is fair, but yeah, this is going to go to Trayvon. On a competitive scale, I'm going to rank this tournament a 5 out of 10. Now, like other tournaments, this is another kind of hard one to rank. In terms of average win percentage, all-time win percentages, in terms of, like, the comp in this tournament, you know, so to say, this is actually the second lowest of all time, and you could say, oh, okay, it's like a 3 out of 10, but I'm gonna give it a 5 out of 10, because unlike World War II, a tournament where not many players had motivation, a lot of players did have motivation in this tournament, so, because, you know, BO2, good game, a lot of people did have way more motivation, aside from maybe Trayvon, he was the only one that just, like, didn't have much motivation, but a lot of people were motivated in this tournament, and this was supposed to be the last tournament as well. So for that reason, it's a 5 out of 10. The thing about this tournament is, realistically speaking, like looking back on it, only 4 players had a legit winning chance at this tournament. So for that reason, it's definitely on the lower end of competitive scale, but we're going to go half-half with this because, like I said, in terms of actual comp, like really Hall of Fame worthy players in it, yes, we have a few really good ones, mainly Jason and Adrian are like the super, like, S tier. Well, we'll talk about the tiering and stuff later, but yeah, either way, in terms of comp, there wasn't, like, it wasn't the most insane tournament in terms of comp, like I said, second lowest, but a lot of people were motivated and trying in this tournament, so we'll go half-half on this and say 5 out of 10. On a fun scale, honestly, this was a 7 out of 10. There were some problems with just setting up the matches and all that, but, especially those last few matches, but either way, this was definitely one of the more fun tournaments of all time. So many plot twists in this tournament. We had Sammy destroying Jason after Jason beat Adrian in round 1. That was definitely a plot twist. Just Peter winning the tournament and beating Jason was definitely a crazy, like I said, underdog story. And then even Trayvon versus Dan was kind of funny. The whole, like, banter between Adrian and Craig. There was a lot of fun things about this tournament. This was really a fun tournament watching-wise. Especially the Peter moments at the end were really fun to watch. And yeah, all that combined is going to make a pretty fun tournament and a 7 out of 10. On an overall scale, I'm going to rank this as 6.5 out of 10 and the 7th best tournament. And I'm going to say this is probably the most underrated tournament of all time because of, I think it was honestly a solid tournament. Now, I'm going to, like I do before, I'm going to rank, I'm going to just list off the bad things about this tournament before we get into the really good things. And I've already mentioned the good things, of course, but let's talk about the bad things. Now, the beginning and the end of this tournament ended off, like, it started off and ended off on a bang, really good. But from rounds 2 to the quarterfinals, that whole middle section of the tournament was terrible. It was a wasteland of just blowout, terrible game. Trayvon letting Dan win. Like, we had 20-1 from Jason, 20-4 Adrian versus Frosty. The only, like, decent game, I guess, was, like, Trayvon versus Chris C. Peter blew out Dan. Sammy blew out Craig. Next round got blown out twice. Like, it was just a complete wasteland from rounds 2 up until the semifinals. That's when it started to pick back up. And for that reason, it lacked a little bit. And then also the lack of, like, Hall of Fame, like, God tier snipers in this tournament. Like I said, we had a few. I think the the closest thing to a God tier sniper in this tournament, well, I would say Adrian is definitely among the God tier snipers. He was definitely in this tournament, of course. But I would say the lack of, like, super good players in this tournament was, like, a downside. But, of course, like I said, round 1, it started off on a bang. The plot twists in this tournament were insane. I've already listed off the reasons before. And of course, yeah, the last 4 matches. And by the way, this is the only tournament in history where both semifinals games and the finals were all underdog victories. And that alone was definitely a crazy thing. And yeah, like I said, from a viewing standpoint, this tournament was electric to watch, especially towards the semifinals and finals. Really fun to watch. And I mean, it was just a crazy tournament. It was definitely a chaotic tournament. So yeah, I mean, that's definitely the most underrated tournament of all time. Didn't beat out some other tournaments. I would say some of those older tournaments, like Season 3, was better. I wouldn't rank this above, like, Season 6 either. Of course, Season 8, the GOAT season, I wouldn't rank it above that. But still, nonetheless, was a really fun tournament, really good tournament, super underrated, and that's all I have to say about that. The best moment of this tournament, there is no secret whatsoever, and we're going to go into very specifics in this tournament. We could maybe even give this a tie, but we're going to talk about Peter versus Jason. This was by far the best moment in this tournament, and the specific moment I'm talking about in this tournament was the Tomahawk bank shot when Peter was down 16-17. It was just such a symbolic and amazing moment. It was just funny, honestly. The symbolic part was that it happened in the exact same controversial room that Jason camped against Adrian in their matchup, and Jason barely, by pixels, missed a shot against Peter, shooting right above his shoulder. It was just crazy. They both missed a bunch, and then Peter getting a bank shot to basically win the game, because after that bank shot, the momentum went in Peter's way, and he took that momentum away. Like, you could argue the bank shot's lucky, but what Peter did after was nothing lucky whatsoever. He outplayed Jason completely after that Tomahawk shot, and that moment is crazy. And honestly, the funny moment I was going to talk about before is when Peter said he was eating chips. That moment really got Jason mad, and I thought it was kind of a funny moment. But honestly, this whole semifinals between Peter and Jason was honestly the best moment of this tournament. And with that being said, that is all I have for this video, and we have maybe 2 more. I probably will eventually do a Season 13 video. But yeah, Season 11 will be our next video. I'm not sure when I'm going to post it. It could honestly be a while, because I'm going to be honest, BO6 is coming out, and that game is going to take a lot of my time. So we'll see, honestly, when Season 11 comes out. But I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and I will see you guys for that one.